Welcome to the occasional gathering of the Saint Macrina Centre. It's lovely to see each one of you. We are doing a series on words and phrases that are significant to the Christian Church and particularly articulated in the context of the patristics and the Eastern Christian tradition. And today, Andrew Bingham is going to open our considerations of the word obedience. So thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, David. It's true. This is part of a series, as David has indicated. We began late last year with cataphasis and apophasis and moved on to authority. And then we spoke of disposition and then reverence and humility. And now we're on obedience. The next end of next month will be a talk on synergy, right? So these are meant to be linked. We want to hold each thing in mind as much as possible when gathering for the next, because continuity and kind of reception and response is at the heart of our meaning making. Today we'll be talking about obedience. And it's curious to talk about today, because today is we're nearing the culmination of Great Lent. And today is the Sunday in which we remember and celebrate and are thankful for the work of Saint John Climacus, as he was called, Saint John of the Ladder. He wrote a book called The Ladder of Divine Ascent. These are steps, slow, careful steps. And perhaps in that book, we might find a kind of ultimate expression or image of obedience. I haven't read it. It's not for me yet. But I think there we might find concentrated purely something of what we'll meet here today. And it is curious because in these Sundays of Great Lent, we dwell with the gifts of prominent saints or prominent aspects of our tradition. And sometimes these are people like John Climacus, who gave us something kind of palpable, or Gregory Palamas, who gave us many palpable things. And sometimes they're of a gift which is less palpable. So next Sunday, we celebrate Saint Mary of Egypt. And we're not really sure what her gift to the church is, but we know it is immense. And somehow she also understood with her whole being in a way too beautiful for us to comprehend, obedience and repentance. In any case, when we're thinking of these people or the tradition itself, we think this is a gift. It's a gift. How do we receive it? How do we make it our own? Right? Tradition means, the word tradition, has a sense the movement of handed down. Handed down, something handed down. And so the immediate question with something handed down is how to make it one's own, how to partake of that gift. What is asked of us to partake? And we have kind of images of when something is asked for us. A common one is we must rise to the occasion. You know, when the occasion presents itself, we rise to it. That's fair enough. Fair enough. Although that kind of speaks of a lassitude preceding energetic output. If one is taught singing lessons, when one reaches the higher notes, one is instructed to try to land on the notes, not rise to it, not scrabble up to it, land on, not rise to the occasion, but land on the notes. The image is something like if we see a fence post, a cat scrambles up a fence post to get to the top to sit there. A bird alights on it. How do we ready ourselves to alight on the gift rather than scramble up to it? And tradition means participation, partaking. Participation or partaking of a current of meaning, a flow of meaning, greater than our own individual will, our own individual horizon, our own way of perceiving meaning. We're partaking in something greater than we are in that sense. And so there's a sense of ascesis or ascetic efforts in tradition. There's a sense of self-discipline at the center of Orthodox tradition. This is both a kind of discipline or ascesis of readiness in order that we're ready, but it's also a kind of discipline or ascesis of ripeness. We discipline ourselves to not only be, but observe ripeness. When something is fully blessed or present or ready to be partaken of. And so the tradition teaches us a readiness for response. It's a lesson in the readiness of response. How will we respond? How will we respond to the gift of the love of Christ? How will we attend while dwelling in the gift of creation? How will we attend to that calling which draws us beyond our own, unto his own? Christianity teaches that our existence is a kind of response. Our whole being is a form of response. There's a gift and we respond to it. The gift comes first and then our part. And yet, beautifully enough, strangely enough, oddly enough, wonderfully enough, this response to the gift of creation also partakes of that gift of creation. So we respond to the love of Christ through the love of Christ, with the love of Christ. Our Christian response is always a co-response, a partaking of the horizon of the light and love of Christ. It's not a willed response or an individual response, it's a partaking. It's a co-response, co-response. In this sense, we can speak of things like obedience and attunement and intimacy. Obedience to be ready for co-response, to be ready to partake. But to be ready, we need to be attuned. We need to be in harmony in order to co-respond. And the horizon of beauty for mutually attuned harmony is intimacy. Mutually attuned, we become intimate. The person in the Christian tradition, Christian life, is formed both as gift and response. The form of our movement is at the center of our being, and the form of the movement is gathering the gift and response. And the gift kind of provides our rootedness, and our response, that's our openness, that's our freedom. So we have both roots and flow, gift and response. That's our movement. We've been given and we respond. And I love this. I didn't know this until recently, but if you look up the etymology of obedience, the roots of obedience mean to just kind of incline oneself in a certain direction. Just kind of direct one's attention. Kind of list towards, like something leans, list towards. or to kind of listen or hearken in the direction of. It's to attend to what may come from this area, from this area. And so our life is both listening and response. And we need to listen beyond our own passion, the passion we feel. And we need to respond beyond our own will, the will we feel. I want this. I'm passionate about this. We need to listen beyond that. Because we do not choose how we shine with others. We don't create our own beauty. And we don't will ourselves unto theosis. The tradition is clear about this. We're not self-made. This movement at the center of our being. What is the range of movement appropriate for our person? The range of movements. We know the range of willed movement is relatively narrow. It's bounded by passion. Beyond our own will, we have our nature. Our natural movement is broader than our willed movements. It's part of the gift of being. And beyond nature, we have grace. Our grace-filled movement, our grace-filled response is expansive. It's transfigurative in the light of Christ. Obedience first sets down the guidance of one's own will. Obedience says, I will not confine the movement of my spirit within the narrow range of mine own will. Obedience, we first set down the guidance of our own will. And the result of this is phrased kind of variously in the tradition. I like the word attunement, a kind of unity of beauty, gathered in terms of beauty. I like the phrase co-response very much. When we're attuned spiritually, we respond to each other with the love of Christ. We also have the term synergy, where the gift of our energy becomes one with divine energy. We have the term communion. This is kind of our way of trying to articulate the fullness of the mystery of the gift of being. In any case, we begin with our own formation, then with others, we enter into conformation, and conformation becomes together transformation. Our formation is our beginning, and we might think of Christian formation in our discussion. It's the question at the center of our inquiry right now, question of formation. As we live in communion with each other, we see how the gift of mutual obedience, mutually setting down our will to be attuned to each other, to be in synergy with each other, proves transformative. In loving co-relation, we become more beautiful than our own, transformed beyond our own. Whether we're speaking in terms of conformation, being together, mutually shaping each other in love, or synergy with the energies of God, which fill and sustain all things, or communion with God Himself beyond our ways of knowing creation. Obedience begins our life together. It begins confirmation, synergy, communion. And obedience in this kind of foundational sense is similar to fasting, or rather, fasting is a form of obedience. What is fasting? Fasting means both setting down, putting aside our images of the world, refusing to allow our passions to overlay our relations. Fasting also means letting be, letting the quiet peace of Christ pervade our whole being, just letting Him be with us, in us, through us. And by setting down our clamorous passions and dwelling with the peace of Christ, in fasting we find our perception clarified. We find our discernment strengthened. And discernment, the Fathers teach us, is the beginning, or maybe the center, of Christian response. If we can discern how to respond, we can respond with love in the light and with the love of Christ. And this word obedience is it's kind of strange spiritually. I don't know why we might resist it. Maybe we don't resist it, but I don't know why we might resist it. It has to do with the kind of passion of our own will. Whenever we hear obedience, we kind of think, but I want to, but I want to. It's odd. And I think that we can see how immature that rejection of obedience is when we think of both sport and music. Right? In sports, if you're going to play the game, you get into fighting shape, game shape. Otherwise, you cannot play well. You don't get to play. In music, you tune your instruments. You need to enter into attunement with others. Otherwise, you produce cacophony, not harmony. And yet somehow in the spiritual life, we think doing our own thing is best. Strange. In our part of the world, the question of formation is also the question of entering, not the question of already participating, but the question of entering. And just like sport, just like music, to partake of the gifts of the church, one must be in shape, attuned to its rhythm, its roots, its flow. And the roots and the rhythm and the flow, the texture of tradition, is only gradually comprehended by long participation. But this participation is worth it, because once we are attuned to the love of Christ, our response will be in that musical register, to use an analogy. We will partake of the light and the love of Christ rather than our own will to shape the world in our own image. Some echoes of obedience. I know of one who, upon entering the church, somehow soon realized it was filled with very, very bright light. And so he set down that fire. He fasted from his own urge to speak of these things and chose instead to just dwell with the tradition, to try to kind of acquire an orthodox mindset or a habit of mind, kind of disposition, to just live the tradition for long enough that he learned its own form of response. And then after 20 years, this is in our time, not in ancient times, after 20 years, we understand he didn't know how to be in the desert. And so he asked a blessing from his godfather to speak and to act publicly. A long period of waiting. There's a story too by Papadimontes, the great Greek writer, Alexandros Papadimontes, called The Monk. And he relates a story of a humble, sincere spirit, a monk, who needed to travel from Mount Athos to Thessaloniki for eye kind of surgery, eye help, medical help. And once he got to Thessaloniki, he became a bit useful in the local church. And so he stayed there and forgot his monkish obedience, liked it. He meant something to his neighbors. They looked to him for guidance. And somehow Papadimontes, who is a great uh, um, artist of our tradition, he conveys that this willed sojourn, apart from the obedience of the monastery, rather than a form of a blessing or goodness to those around him, and especially to himself, it was more a form of distraction or diffusion of the truth he held. Distraction or diffusion, those are ways of kind of almost giving or spreading out. I said earlier, well, that kinesis or movement is the center of our being. And two major theologians often in conversation now, Maximus and Origen, that's where you get that from. They both see movement as the center of being. And Maximus and Gregory Palamas teach us that this movement is twofold. It's both forward unto another, the giving, in which we emulate the gift of Christ, but it's also circular unto our own. And these two movements, the movement within and the movement outwards, are as one, are as one. Concentration, centering on our own, opens up the gift of another. And the gift of another opens up concentration of our own. It's both unto and both within. Obedience teaches us the beauties of these two kinds of movements. The tradition knows these two movements well. We don't individually, but we can by partaking. In Christianity, the concentration of love is both for our own and for the life of the world, and they're not different. They're as one. Perhaps concentration is the main movement of obedience, perhaps. But we do know concentration as the essence of Christian movement and its energy of delightful communion. And we know this clearly, palpably. Christ says the kingdom of heaven is within you, within at our center. The light and the love of the Logos of God is at our very center. But we are taught too that our own is as his own, for we are made in the likeness of Christ. And we are taught too, and explicitly in the liturgy, that mine own is thine own, and mine own is of thine own. It is thine own of thine own. We are made in the image of God. And so we pray, and this is a form of an expression of obedience. We pray in response to the love of Christ, thy will be done. For he loves us beyond our own felt ways of knowing and being. And it's by letting go and beginning to partake of that gift beyond the horizon of our own will. That's how we can begin to understand obedience. So now, let's chat together. Let's think together about these matters.
May I speak? I am overwhelmed with what I've heard, to the point that it is ridiculous and that it is laughable at how simple and poignant and understandable what you've laid across in such a radical manner. Please forgive me. David knows that I can be long-winded, but I've got like these notes. My whole life, I've understood obedience meaning to hear and comply. You've described it as to listen and move, and that there's a mutuality in obedience. And my own bias coming from, being the descendant of slaves, that word has a particular connotation, it has a particular negative resonance with me. And I think, but at the same time, when I think of the faith and the religion of my ancestors, I can also understand how obedience and our empathy with the crucified, suffering Christ is the reason why I'm here today. I think about the words you said, that to incline oneself towards a certain direction. I think about listening versus hearing, and that even in the word hear, I think about from a legal standpoint of there's a hearing, that the person who's listening has the right to adjudicate, has the right to evaluate, has the right to make a judgment, and then to respond, and then to move. I look at how, from what you're saying, and we want to obey, we want that mutuality, we want that communion. We do not choose how we shine with others. The self-awareness that's required about how what we say and what we expect of others, and the great gift it is when we have full awareness And when that shining through happens, in that mutuality. And then I think about this letting go and putting aside, that in order to be in this communal moment, you have to put aside your ego. You have to put aside your passions, your wants. You have to have full apprehension. You have to grab hold of what's essential in that relationship. And so that through this conversation, it's given me an even deeper understanding of the Eastern understanding of that relationship between any parties, much less human and the divine. In that obedience for me growing up as I did, it was obey this great God who has power over you and will determine your fate. Whereas this understanding of obedience says that it is a journey and there is mutual acquiescence, and that mutual acquiescence will power my own salvation and the salvation of the other. So this is a transformative conversation, and I thank you for it. And I've only given you half of the notes I took, so I will give up my time to the senator from Edmonton.
That's well put, Steve. Well put. We'll return to some of those ideas. Yes.
What Stephen said there, it made me really think of many African Americans. They have a deep affinity for the book of Exodus in the Bible. I mean, the Israelis had to be obedient through those years in the wilderness to their journey to the promised land. It wasn't a hierarchical dominant obedience. It was an obedience of following God through the wilderness. It wasn't a dominance thing. It was, are you a part of the journey? Are you participating in the journey?
If I could just add quickly, I just returned from Memphis, my ancestral home, for a funeral. And in this cemetery, I've spoken to David before. It's an enormous cemetery on a hill where 8 out of every 10, maybe 9 out of every 10 people in the cemetery are related to me by blood or marriage. And Derek, when you speak of Exodus, I think that I understand it deeply, in that I am compelled to obey, to follow the path that they forged for me. I stand on their shoulders, and they call to me frequently in my walk amongst other human beings. And even though I am compelled willingly. It is consensual. It is a draw that is life-giving. I need it. I must have it. It's not a passion or a want or a desire. It is super essential to who I am. And so when you said that, and I apologize for jumping in, it just triggered these roots that I have and how they define me, and both push me and pull me and call to me. And I thank you, brother, for that word.
Okay, Hindi.
I find it interesting that Steve is looking back at his ancestry and appreciating, this topic. My experience in South Africa as a student, was an exposure to another way of looking at, scriptures or scriptural history and the way people respond to it. That the experience of apartheid, made South African Christians very suspicious, about themes like this or topics like this. I remember one of their, academics saying that when I read the book of Exodus, I feel like, the book of Joshua, the conquest of the land, he said he identifies with the Canaanites, who are deprived, that kind of a thing. And here, Steve is telling us, drawing from the experience of slavery, to understand the concept of, of obedience. And I find that very, very interesting. I never knew that, you could possibly see some of this kind of thing in a light, in a positive light. But I also think, and I'm wondering whether, when we are talking of obedience, our response is not, I wonder whether our response is not informed about our sense of being safe. If I don't feel safe, can I respond? If I don't trust and feel safe, can I respond? And I tend to think, I'm just wondering in my mind, each time I'm anxious to follow a path, I look inside, I think there's a kind of fear about my vulnerability. And I want us to, I don't know if somebody can shed light on that aspect. But thank you, Steve, for that courageous, and, looking back, some people look back and they're bitter, yeah. Thank you.
I would just say to you, brother, that being forced against one's will to do something out of fear of the lives of those you love is different than what we're talking about. That's manipulation. That is a power dynamic based on dominance, not authority. Those who behave in such a manner and those who behave in dictatorial, autocratic manners today, they have no authority. They're only exercising power. Obedience is only authentic when it is consensual. True obedience in the root of the word. Dominance and exploitation and manipulation have stolen that word and turned it into something else. But it is not what we're speaking of, because those slaves looked beyond the slave master. They saw beyond the great veil. They saw the kingdom of God within themselves. They recognized from where their salvation came. And they put on that mask of compliance for those that they love. And that is not of what I speak, and it's certainly not of what you speak. There's a missing link between myself and you that was caused by the Middle Passage. And so to the degree that I and others like me can reestablish that broken link between you and us, that's to the degree we will begin to understand this definition, this true, authentic definition of obedience. But I understand your hesitation. I share it, even as I speak, because how I've been raised and how I've been taught and what I know, what I thought I knew, still has some sway over me. Call it PTSD, call it what you will. But when you speak, I know of what you speak. And I thank you for saying it.
Maybe just a little biblical footnote, responding to Kehinde and Steve. The difficulty with the book of Exodus is that many people read it as if it's a historical linear story, and thus it becomes a story of escape, liberation, and then conquest. You know, Martin Buber points out that the Bible should never be read that way, that the meaning of a text is never at the end of the text. It's always in the midst of the text. And the various, the kind of landscape that Andrew painted for us here around obedience, if you just cast your mind back on the prophet Moses and his discernment and his struggle, his sense of ambiguity, his sense of wanting to draw near, his going behind the mountain, and you know, receiving his vocation, realizing that this drawing near is possible, hearing what Adonai says to him, and then his long period of time when he went and lived among not the Egyptian pagans, but not the Jewish faithful, but a different group of pagans. A long desert period for him of discernment. And then the journey across the desert as well. How many times, I mean, that whole narrative is about presumption and listening, hearing and abiding and abandonment. The whole thing is about that struggle within the human mind and the human heart and within human communities as well. And the golden strand in it speaks to obedience as a beginning. So it's I can certainly understand people reading it. It was one of I appreciated what liberation theology was trying to say, but it always struck me as that they were not reading the narrative. They were just looking at a particular result at the end of the day. But the narrative and the spiritual meaning in the narrative is very much about this question of the way Andrew has drawn our attention to obedience as listening and responding, this the synergy that's involved in that, and the movement to transformation, to no longer being a slave, And then, of course, the next chapter opens up. And then the movement is going to carry on through from the first covenant through the second covenant, building temple, having a king, having a priesthood, and then finally having it all fall apart. And then finally the holiness covenant, which is all about transformation, where you no longer have to hang on to things. You no longer have to pretend, but you can draw near.
Just to respond to David's comment a little bit and looking back at you, Steve and Kendi. We like to say our response forms the horizon of meaning for an event. If we read the Holy Scriptures and we simply see history there instead of the movement of being, then that response provides the horizon of meaning. We're confining that to our own will. David's caution around confusing being and history is very good. We don't pretend that these men and women meant nothing, that they were just for us an abstract lesson for us, not at all. But we also don't decide where their beauty shines forth. One of the issues with giving examples is that one can kind of, as it were, seem to contain a flow within an identification. Just listening to the biblical narratives evoked now, one thinks also of Abraham and Isaac. And that's an image of obedience. Although we might not think so. If obedience is twisted into self-disfiguration, then we lose the whole thing. If authority is misunderstood as willful force, we lose the whole thing. This is part of the reason why right now we're walking around trying to kind of gather and link themes, right? When we spoke of authority, we had this in mind. It's important what you bring up, Steve, very important. And that's why we spoke of it there. Next month, we speak of synergy. We see how difficult it is to remain peaceful when something central to our tradition is presented in terms of well, not in terms of its, but as disfigured. Like the temptation in the garden, all we need is one word, the word, to be mistaken, for us not to be ready to respond, for us to be really misled. And so it's good we go to these difficult words, or these words which might immediately give us pause, and walk through them and see how the light of Christ shines through this too. It's good. It's why we've done authority, humility, reverence. It's very good. And we note that whatever, I mean, we're not kind of cinematic about it. But whatever we think is a temptation of a non-Christian way of life begins with misleading us about one of the central truths of our tradition. That's all. It's saying obedience means this, not that. Authority means this, not that. Christ is this, not that. It's just a slight deviation. And part of what this discipline of obedience, the discipline of ascesis, the discipline of attunement, the discipline of synergy, is doing is to make it harder for us to kind of diverge on one point and therefore lose the thread of the whole. We begin to see how it coheres. And once you do begin to see how it coheres, it's beautiful. It's beautiful beyond measure. There's no end to it.
I even now look at other words like Christ, he did compel, he did coerce, but I have a different understanding of those words, in that he drew people to him. And if you listen and hear the call of the Holy Spirit, you are compelled, you are coerced. You can't
Drawn.
you draw
Be
it, but
careful.
that's right. In the sense, that's right. So I'm using those words in this Christian understanding, similar to obedience, because you are moving towards your creator, you're moving towards love and light. And of there is no other, if you're open, if you do set aside ego and your passions, then it removes the barriers and you frankly run towards him. So I'm even rethinking all these other words that held these negative connotations for me through a true Christian understanding.
That's well put, Steve. Well perceived, well articulated.
I think the important thing is freedom of response. Are we free to respond? I mean, I too, like, Steve, my background is German. And so, I mean, one of the authors that I've read, and I read it for a paper that I wrote for David, was around creative disobedience, which is a work by Dorothy Zöller, who was writing theology in the aftermath of World War II as a German, where obedience was greatly abused, right, in the whole Nazi regime. And I mean, the echoes of that in today's politics are scary, right? So, like, is there a freedom of response? Who are we responding to? Does that individual or that authority love us, or are they trying to co-opt us or coerce us in the negative sense? Versus, is it a loving drawing out, which I think is more what traditional Christian understanding of obedience would be. So I share that sort of hesitation around the word obedience because there's this cultural baggage around it.
Did you say creative disobedience? Was that the term?
Yeah, creative I'll put it in the chat. Creative disobedience, and she writes of it. I just reread the opening lines. She says, as a woman, as a German, as a Christian, how has this word obedience been abused? Right? I mean, it's abused in marriages between men and women as well. So just how to play with that.
Muted, David.
She writes a kind of a remarkable reflection on the suffering of God, which is kind of the takeoff point for the book that I think Niels has referred to. And that's, of course, captured in the words that Andrew spoke here. The words that we hear, and I suppose often hear them for the first time, although they're echoed throughout the scripture. Not my will, but thine. And but another part of this that I'd like to maybe, Andrew, have you just speak to a little bit. I don't want it to lead us far afield. I hope it would help a little bit, maybe put a little some additional texture on it. In the Eastern Church, we have some within the kind of well, within the literature, but also within the kind of popular culture of the church and in its ethos, there is a fair bit of attention given to obedience. And I sometimes wonder about how it's understood. There are obediences that are given by elders to disciples or to spiritual children. There are obediences that can be given by priests to people. And of course, these of course can be abused because obviously, and that's really what I'd like you to just maybe say a little bit about. What is going on when that kind of obedience is given out of hearing and response versus when it's given perhaps on some other kind of ground? Am I clear on what I'm trying to get at here?
I think so. I think so. But I think you've just laid the carpet down for my question that I was going to ask you, which was, when we think of obedience in terms of trying to learn something which wasn't our part of our initial formation, how is that different than the term, the idea, the act of obedience, given when the tradition, the way of life has been lived from infancy? I think that what you indicate, and you're being modest, you know much more of this than I do, but what you indicate with the abuse of that term is someone playing with fire. They've seen some fire. They've been blessed with the gifts of the tradition. But instead of understanding mine own to be of thine own, God's own, we understand, okay, mine own can direct things. Here's what we can do. And somehow, it's indescribable, but somehow the center of ourselves becomes just us, not Christ in us. And we forget ourselves when we begin to speak in our own terms. In terms of our own will, obedience is almost always subjugation, another subjugating to us, or I mean, if it's on our own selves, some kind of self-abnegation, which isn't entirely healthy. There has to be a kind of innocence involved in the giving of obedience, a kind of lightness. You know, in one work of art, television show I like, one character says to another upon giving him something, take it light, but take it. Take it lightly, but take it. You must take this, but take it lightly. It's light, but take it. And so, David, I wonder if you might just be willing to reflect very, at whatever length you wish, but on the idea of formation. Formation and tradition and obedience. Most of us, I don't want to speak out of place, so forgive me if I mischaracterize anyone here, but much of the conversation in our part of the world is people who are coming to terms with living the tradition rather than those who have been in it from birth and kind of just swim in it with joy and ease. I'm not saying that's better or worse. I'm just saying that's what we face. So for us, obedience is kind of like, it's a different way of being. How do we, and I think that's where that fault that you gesture gently towards, then it becomes a question of will. Well, I see it like this. I think you should. I. And then it becomes closer to what Steve was talking about earlier and others. But when it, instead of that, is kind of more in the terms we were talking about now, and more in the terms of fine tuning You know, some of the central texts of obedience in the church, Ladder of Divine Ascent is one. That's why I haven't touched it. The Pedalion is another. That's why I haven't touched it. There are central texts which are of an ascetic rigor, which is immediately appealing for its rigor, but also probably very soon mishandled if one is not ready. What's the difference of obedience when one is formed in the tradition, to put it kind of bluntly, and when one comes to the tradition and is, reformed? What do you see, David? What did the first, the kind of initial movements of our tradition, how did they see formation and obedience, or even grafting, like we were saying earlier, a grafting on, a conjoining? What do you see there?
If obedience, as you have spoken about it, and I think you said it so well, is inclining oneself in its root, listening toward his own as mine own, our own as his own. That is, it's fundamentally about a movement into communion. If that's the case, then then obedience is fundamentally dialogical. That is, it's fundamentally a word being spoken by one to another. But that word spoken is always and only a word from the Logos. It is always and only a word that Christ is speaking through one to another. So the notion of well, it comes back to that, our discussions in part on authority as well. There is no authority unless something is authored, unless something is made new, unless something is drawn into the light. So the habit of mind which thinks one knows something, or one has a particular kind of authority within a structure. It's not that those are bad, they're all fine. But what we're talking about here, obedience as a spiritual response in which we grow in wholeness, that's, you take your shoes off in the presence of those moments. Those are moments where, in that sense, obedience only exists when we hear the voice of Jesus Christ calling us to a deeper relationship. And all other kinds of authority or instruction or what have you are of a different order than that. So obedience, as you've talked about it, requires not that one obeys something, but that one hears something and that one moves because of what you've heard. So in that sense, it's always I think of maybe one of the greatest texts about this is actually the Song of Songs. It's the voice of the beloved and the response of the loved. That's where obedience can occur. It can occur where we hear the voice of the beloved and we respond as beloved, as the loved one. So I guess what I was trying to get at is, so often we try and force the flower. If one ever has any kind of position of authority, one of the temptations of that is to assume that if one asks a person to obey something, this, that, or the other thing, that somehow will bring life. Or it'll bring an affirmation of my authority. But that's never what occurs in the Song of Songs. And as you have spoken about it, I mean, what's so striking to me about it is that obedience in that sense it arises within a relationship. It arises when you've heard a word that actually is calling you deeper, calling you closer. That's obedience. So you mentioned Papadiamante's short story, The Monk. And in that story, you summarized it very, very concisely and very briefly. But as I recall it, the monk finds all kinds of good reasons to continue to do a variety of things. And what he's doing is good things. They're all good things. None of them is not good. They're all good things. But then he hears a voice which is deeper than his own heart. And then he moves in a different direction. But that kind of turning around, that kind of metanoia, I don't know, of course, but it seems to me usually doesn't really occur until that those moments arise where we hear a word, a life-giving word that speaks to the deepest word of our heart. And in that moment, and Steve sort of gestured towards this, I think, too, that moment has a certain kind of eros attached to it. That is, it is a moment of really being drawn. So in that sense, if I've heard you correctly, obedience describes this synergy, this synergetic moment where there is a movement deeper, both a movement towards the Logos and a movement of one's own logoi towards that which is beloved. And in that moment, the image of God shines.
Or is it then right to say that if the logos is at the center, then there is of necessity discernment?
I'm sorry, Kahindi, you said
So that
is what?
If the logos is at the center and critical to understanding, to hearing, wouldn't discernment be critical to know that this is the voice of the shepherd?
Mm-hmm.
And there's the constraint of love to want to obey, to respond accordingly. Just wondering, if we need discernment in recognizing or in perceiving, that this is the voice of the shepherd, of the good shepherd.
I guess what I was trying to walk around was this notion that obedience only occurs when the voice of the Good Shepherd is heard. When the voice of the Good Shepherd is spoken, and when the voice of the Good Shepherd is heard. All other matters are of another kind of order. And that isn't about obedience. Maybe about something else, maybe about something that's good. But it's not what Andrew has laid out for us here in terms of obedience. All these other matters, the gift isn't being received. Something may be received, but the gift isn't being received. It's not being made one's own, partaken of. So in that sense, this understanding of obedience is also really a moment of communion. There is the old expression of heart speaking to heart. What that does is it at least heightens some notion that what is being received and the response, there's a deep relationship between those. And so Andrew's cautionary notes, even about reading something like St. John Climacus, it's one thing to just read these things, memorize a few things from it, note down a few ideas, but that's different. You have to be ready for it. And I think I expect every good parent knows when a child is able to hear a word that calls forth obedience instead of having them heave to. And you have to do both as a parent. You have to do both because you have to protect your children. But what a tragedy if the only thing they ever know is the word of heaving to. And they never hear that word coming from you, the word of the Good Shepherd, as you put it, Kahindi, which speaks to their heart, helps them know how deeply they are loved and recognized, and that they can come home.
John, you had your hand up.
It's been lovely listening to all this because since the topic for this month was announced, I've been thinking a lot about obedience, and it's been delightful for me to hear kind of Andrew's reflections, which come from a completely different direction than my thoughts, but sort of mesh together so nicely. And thank you, Steve, for particularly the way in which you draw attention to the way in which this word is co-opted in the exercise of dominance and power. And it's so difficult to get away from. It even occurs in places in the Bible, often in the third party. So the centurion who recognizes Christ's authority by saying, I have men under me, and I tell them to go here and go there, and they go. This is how he understands obedience. And the people in the crowd who marvel that even the evil spirits obey him. And without understanding a notion of obedience and who Christ actually is. But when I started thinking about obedience this last week, it was actually directly proceeding from what we were talking about at the end of last month. And my thoughts about what one of the Desert Fathers refers to as the uncondemned animals, our fellow creatures. And I was actually listening to a song, and I can't remember the name of the group, but the song has this kind of Ovidian metamorphosis in it. A young man who gets lost in the woods and is adopted by a pack of wolves and ends up becoming one. And as he says, I lost the taste for judging right from wrong, for my skin had turned to fur, and my thoughts they surely were turned to instinct and obedience to God. And that relationship of instinct and obedience. Obedience to God is obedience to our created nature. So as various people have alluded to today, the centrality for us as humans is the image of Christ, the image of God that is in our created nature. And to be obedient is to be obedient to that nature in the direct and simple way that all of the other uncondemned animals remain obedient to their created nature. But we know that we can take an animal, even a relative wild animal, and we can condition it, and we can train it and breed it to obey us. We have classes for dogs, which we call them obedience classes, in which we train dogs not to be obedient to their nature. Or as David put it in that lovely phrase, the chilling phrase, to force the flower. That we are able to domesticate. And I think we are domesticated, and that sin is a kind of domestication that takes us and conditions us away from our created nature into a nature in which, among other things, we are able to misunderstand the nature of obedience and to use obedience as something in which we force other people to do, or in which we allow ourselves to be forced to do things, to be coerced and compelled. So formation and discernment, which I think go together, can be thought of as a kind of rewilding, a breaking of the domestication of sin, and a turning towards and a discernment of our nature that is our created nature, the image of God that is in us, through this heavy, heavy veil of sin and conditioning. And this is one of the simply practical ways in which we need a savior. We need the good shepherd. We need that voice, and we need the formation and the discernment to hear that voice and to respond to it. Because we've had so many centuries of this conditioning and this breeding, even turning us away from our created nature.
That's really brilliantly put, John. Really brilliantly put. And it strikes me, I mentioned Saint Mary of Egypt earlier, and her name day is my birthday, and her Sunday is next Sunday, so she's very much on my mind. We know that her biography, that the tiny bit we know of it, includes communion with a lion. We read of Saint Seraphim of Sarov, his communion with bears. Many times in the scriptures, we read of a saint, a holy person who is fully at peace with the animal, with what you put. And it makes me think that obedience, even that gap you were talking about, obedience depends upon a distance. If we're always, in relation, conjoined to, there'd be no need for. So it's for us. And it makes me think too of that contrast between the range of movement of the will and the range of movement of our nature, which you just evoked beautifully. And then we know as human beings, we're called even, not that the rest of creation is not blessed in so particular way, but we know we also have the blessing of grace-filled life, which moves us even beyond that. That's really well put. Really well put. That's all. Really well put. Thank you.
Amazingly put. Stunning. Thank you. Next time we tell our dogs to sit, I'm going to think about it totally differently now.
One of the things I love so much about dogs, so is the degree to which it seems of their nature to want to please. When I see people trying to force a dog to do something, I mean, apart from the fact that the dog clearly isn't enjoying it, it seems such a futile way to go about it, considering how easy it is to invite a dog to do what you want it to do. Um,
John, I've heard it said that obedience school is not really for the dogs, but the owners to learn to properly speak to the dogs.
the best of them, yeah.
This is really good, and we could go on. But also, let's keep in mind that next month we're talking about synergy, and it flows from this. I mean, 2 months ago we had reverence and humility, or a month ago. Now we have obedience, synergy. These are all connected. The gift is integral. The gift is whole. Thank you all very much for being here. Go on, Steve.
I was going to say Jeremy was going to say something, and just from his background, I would really love to hear a word from him before we go.
Yeah. Well, it's been hard because there's been so much good things said. I feel like, well, not much left to say. But the language, and my computer crashed in the middle of it, so I don't know if I'm repeating anyone, but Andrew, when you were talking about the word of attunement, like just how relational is it? And I think of like attachment theory and psychology and just how we bond and connect to each other, and just the sacred relationship of parent and child, and how, I don't like the word obedience, but it's been sort of resurrected today. But the idea that I think we can obey, or a child can obey, when the child knows that the parent has their best interest in heart, when it's not retributive, but it's restorative. So like, this is for my good, and I believe it's for my good because I know you love me, and there's that trust there, versus like the, obey and comply. So there's, we need safety in order to be vulnerable, to be open, and we need vulnerability to have intimacy. And so if there isn't that trust and safety in that relationship, then we're not going to hear or receive that word. But when there's safety, then we can have the vulnerability to be open to it so that we can move toward deeper intimacy and closeness. And I think obedience is maybe like, when there's trust there, obedience feels like the medicine for you to go deeper. So anyway, thanks everybody.
That's well put. And it brings to mind one other thing. Safety. We set that down. That's a cliche of today that we seem to want to insert into everything. But trust. Now we see, without a proper sense of authority, how can we understand obedience? Without a proper sense of trust, how can we understand any of this? And that's where we're walking through. We want to walk through each of these aspects, each of these pillars, slowly, with patience, to say, yeah, look, if we look over here, it's also beautiful. It's a gift of Christ. We look over here, it's also beautiful, right? We don't have to doubt anything of the gift, but we run into stumbling blocks constantly. Trust, safety, authority, and that's what we're doing. We're being gentle and not backing away. We keep on, and we'll find that each of these things, as revealed by the tradition, is full of life and full of love. We will find that. We know that. We just have to learn how to listen and respond. David.
Oh, thank you. It was lovely
Sorry, I thought you. Go on.
Oh, lovely to hear all of you. Appreciate it. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you all for being here. Remember, 1 month from now, a note will come out. Thank you. It's a blessing to be together.
On just a quick word on the blessing of being together. I've only just realized today that this is one of the years when the Western Easter and the Orthodox Easter fall on the same weekend. So I'm considering it a special blessing that we'll be together in that way.
Indeed.
Ciao, everyone. Ciao.
Bye-bye.